Hello and welcome to Creating a Human Rights Culture, which aims to promote a lived awareness of the interdependency and indivisibility of human rights principles in our minds, hearts, and bodies, that is, dragged into our everyday lives. What, after all, is freedom of speech to a person who is homeless and lives in a world at war? Therefore, it is dedicated ultimately to the application of the Human Rights Triptych, which in brief consists of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights at its center, the conventions, that is, international treaties on the right, and implementation measures on the left. Hello everyone, I'm Joseph Wronka, and welcome to another episode of Creating a Human Rights Culture. Today we're going to take a look at the situation of Indigenous people in Western Massachusetts. And this is also one way to commemorate Indigenous Peoples Day. That's coming up the first Monday of October. So here I am with Mr. Rolf Pabahtanumwe.
Pabahtanumwe.
Say it again.
Pabahtanumwe.
How are you doing?
Nice to meet you.
Okay, good to see you. And his last name is Schilling. He is one of the last probably 24 speakers of Nipmuc who's alive. So he's a powerhouse of knowledge, and we have to exploit it, for lack of a better word. Now, to place this show in context, not everybody knows this, but there is a United Nations document called the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. Its acronym, I think it's kind of weird, but it's called UNDRIP. The United Nations endorsed it in 2007. During that time, it was vetoed by Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and the United States, countries with, guess what, sizable indigenous populations. Since, for whatever reason, the mobilization of shame perhaps, they all signed on, and the last country that signed on was, guess who? Us, the United States of America. It signed on in 2010. And not many people know this, but I'm reminded of the aphorism that if a tree falls in the forest and nobody's there to listen to it, it doesn't make a sound. In other words, nobody really knows it. And around that time, President Obama, on his behalf, did apologize for what the United States did to indigenous people. But again, nobody really heard it, I don't think. So was the apology really heard? Let me just finish this, and then the floor is yours. So what is the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People? Just very briefly, it talks about the right to self-determination for indigenous people, to pursue their economic and social development and strengthen their distinct cultural characteristics. It talks about full guarantees against genocide, redress for deprivations of cultural values, the right to control the education of indigenous children, the right to establish their own media, the right to traditional medicines and health practices, and the right to strengthen distinctive spiritual and material relationship with land, waters, seas, and other resources owned, and also full recognition of cultural and intellectual property such as genetic resources, needs, medicines, and knowledge of cultural traditions. Okay, so Rolf, the floor is yours. Do you have any thoughts on that document? And you also gave me a list of questions. Why don't we start with one of the questions, and also if you could give me thoughts on the document.
Sure.
And the first question that you have: why does the United States criticize other nations for their human rights violations when the United States is engaged in hundreds of human rights violations as a matter of routine? And how does this play out for Native Americans? The floor is yours.
Well, thank you. Thank you for having me here too. I think the goals, as you read them in the Human Rights Declaration, are admirable, and I look forward to that day.
Yes.
I think many people do. When you contrast that with this question that's on the table, it shows you the gap between the goal and the present situation. It's an interesting predicament we have here. We are sort of considered ourselves as a nation the policemen, if you will, of the world. I don't know if that's really appropriate, but we've sort of taken that position since the early part of the 1900s, probably assuming that on our economic and military power. And I think it's admirable when a powerful nation thinks that it has a responsibility to do the right thing. I don't know that policing and enforcing are the best ways to achieve that, and maybe other people can argue that besides me. But it's an admirable thought that we have this power, we have this prestige, we have this wealth. Let us apply that to ensure human decency around the world. And I think in many ways the United States did help that on one end. And I think unfortunately sometimes our foreign policy undermined that. In other ends, sometimes pretty glaringly, unfortunately often involving indigenous populations. Just to refer to one situation that brings that into focus, we very much through CIA operations undermined President Allende, I'm not sure how to say it correctly.
Yes.
And he was removed and replaced by a military personnel of low rank.
Pinochet, yeah.
Yeah, I don't care to say his name very often.
Okay.
It's just a habit of mine, but he was a low-ranking officer, and that is relevant to point out, with no political experience. And ran the country in what we all now know was a brutal and genocidal fashion. But what a lot of people don't know is that the main victims of his policies were the native people in Chile, and who are still the Mapuche, who are lobbying and struggling peaceably for their rights and their land, who form a significant portion of Chile's population, and retain a significant portion of its land base, which the Chileans chose not to settle or take from them for a very long time, but are aggressively selling off now for resource extraction. They are labeled terrorists and treated as such, and mowed down by the gun, by police. And internationally, they're not relieved of this false label. The situation doesn't receive examination in the press internationally. It's just accepted that they're now terrorists. There are actually people who have always lived there who are experiencing a resurgence, a second stage genocide, and who are resisting that peaceably. The framework that we accept of discussion is not appropriate. And the United States has unfortunately had a negative influence on that by throwing human rights accusations at one after another country with which we are at political, odds.
Right.
And where we start to apply cultural and moral value judgments on another country when our conflict with them is actually political. And when you look into the basis of the political conflict, it's actually economic. So we're looking at countries whose resources we want, and we're criticizing their human rights. So we're criticizing the Taliban in Afghanistan for doing what? For repressing women, repressing education access, repressing human rights, and other
When it's
violations.
rich in resources.
Yes.
Yes.
And also destroying sacred sites. They blew up the Buddhas of Bamiyan, which is a piece of heritage that belongs to all of humanity. Yet the United States, in complete parallel to the same kind of commissions, has been doing similar things. People have considered passing legislation not allowing women to wear hijab. And the assumption is that women are forced to wear that. But that is not the point of view iterated by many Muslim women. Many Muslim women have come forward to defend their right to wear hijab. And, if a woman if it's a woman's not being forced to wear one, why is it ever necessary to make a law telling her she can't? So I think there are a lot of presumptions that are uneven. So when we as a nation talk about human rights violations of other countries, we are not doing ourselves a favor at home or internationally if we don't first look to ourselves.
Okay, can you say a few words about what the U.S. government did to the human rights of indigenous people in the United
sure.
States? And if you don't mind bringing some of this to Western Massachusetts.
Absolutely.
Because I have some ideas on that too. And
Great.
I
I'm
mean,
sure you have a mountain of information.
well,
about
I
that.
know. I was at Shelburne Falls recently, and then there's a sign over there. It's in Mosaic or something that says, literally says,
Oh, yes.
we stole their lands, and then we set up the courts, and then we allowed the natives to go hunting and fishing within a 2-mile radius, and they're not ashamed to say it. It's bizarre.
Yeah, it's
Well,
laid
that's
in
just
language
my
on every
thing.
level. And that's a
But
great
anyway,
example.
so-
That brings us right to home.
So let's talk about other things that are going on,
I'd like to focus in...
or whatever you want to do. Maybe do some more history
Absolutely.
of human rights violations in the United States or Western Mass. So,
That brings a nice lens on this because if we talk about Massachusetts and we talk about the history of human rights in Massachusetts, first of all, we have to understand that Europeans who came here were somewhat lacking in human rights themselves, and that's why in many instances they came here. They were fleeing oppression, to which I think all Native people are very sympathetic. And historically, you know, we can evidence that by the fact that when the Pilgrims got here, in a very tattered state, if you look at what was said by the Wampanoag and Pokanoket and other people who, in Nauset and other people who very early contacted them, they've had a great deal of pity and sympathy for these people in their condition.
I bet they did.
And they were given land right away without any contest. But that's our tradition. We don't leave people out in the cold to die. We do take people in, and that's recorded across the history of contact. It's sort of an undeniable aspect. We even take our enemies in, like I'm both Mohawk and Nipmuc. The Mohawk took in Nipmuc, who were refugees several times over from violence, even though we were traditionally competitors and through a lot of ire back and forth at each other, and even had a number of battles. So it began in a beautiful way. Some people showed up looking for refuge, and they were looking for a promised land, and they had their own worldview, and they encountered the people who were prepared to understand them as fellow humans, and to share and take them in, and to give them land, and to respect their sovereignty. The Pilgrims were not subsumed by Massasoit's alliance. They were not forced to capitulate. They were not forced to recognize us as their superiors, and they were not forced to give up anything. They were just given. That's how we do. We give, and then we expect, we hope, and that we'll develop a relationship where people will then be willing to give back in equal. And if that doesn't happen, then we don't develop a good relationship, but we don't take. We don't start by taking. And you could argue that the land they were given was the land of avoidance because an epidemic had just moved through, which is a possibility. It was certainly, unfortunately, emptied of humans at that time by that tragedy, which may have come with the fishermen that were coming across the ocean, bringing a lot of diseases that we were not resistant to our direction. But then it moved on, and there was some relatively, or I should say comparatively, decent relationships or even relationships early on. Of course, they were the Europeans who had arrived were a small, struggling group, and they were amidst a much larger groups, but their immediate neighbors were also struggling because they had just been decimated by a very severe epidemic, which Bradford actually interpreted in his Pilgrim's Progress as that God had cleared the land of us in order to make way for his people, apparently believing that God loved them and cared not for another race, which is not a happy piece, and that point of view is not a happy piece. But the relationships were
By the way, after
comparatively
that point of
decent.
view, I go to Geneva. It's still the way of looking at things of the Supreme Court in the Teton decision, which you're probably familiar with, basically said that Alaska, by the law of conquest, is supposed to be for Christians. And it left out the Native American people.
Yeah, which was a false document in the sense that it wasn't ever conquered.
I know that, but it says
yes,
the law of conquest.
Right,
This
yes,
is the
sir.
Supreme Court.
Absolutely,
so,
yes.
excuse me, I'm sorry,
Yeah.
I didn't mean
No,
to
I
interrupt.
no,
so
I
keep
agree.
on going, so.
You're right, and in my argument against that decision, it falls
I
onto,
think
I think
so.
partly Ambassador Barnes probably explained that far better than I will ever be able to explain, and I wish them luck in asserting the truth about their sovereignty. Yes, there is that the law of conquest, although I've never seen it written down anywhere, and it's not part of our Constitution, and I don't see it amongst our statutes. But I think it's what really is properly referred to as a dicta or dictum. They're dicta. They don't really have any legal precedent. They're just assumptions and become laws or facts because somebody of power spoke it. But strictly speaking, it doesn't have a statutory basis. Moving on from the initial contact, though, here's where we start to have problems with human rights. Well, first of all, I think it's pertinent to say that the Puritan fathers, the Puritans came over and they assumed a lot of control very quickly. And the Puritans were of a different class and even, you could argue, ethnicity. A lot of the Pilgrims were Cornish. The Puritans were mostly Midland English and from East Anglia, or what used to be called East Anglia. And in England, that matters. The Cornish English and Cornish still make jokes about each other, though they may not seem different to us. In any case, the Puritan fathers were not in any way libertarians, and they were definitely against the concept of human rights. Although maybe that's not completely fair to say that, but they certainly didn't see anybody as having any freedoms other than what the church fathers endowed to people, and the church fathers were the only authority of any kind in their worldview. So that bears on the situation. There's also a very intolerant dogma that they were applying that didn't really make space for anybody to be different. Not to slander the religion, but I don't think there's many followers of Puritanism alive today, but that is a recognized and much published aspect of their teachings. That there begins the real violence of conflict and the real abrogation of human rights about that time. And about 1630, we have horrifying murder or a horrifying massacre at Mystic, where an entire village of people are burned in their houses. Something Native America had not seen in human memory.
And nobody knows about.
It's not a commonly discussed thing, although it's definitely one of the founding moments of early American history. And probably everybody covered that for a couple of minutes somewhere in their elementary education, because it is a basic tenet of
I've
American.
been to Mystic a number of times, never saw it.
Interestingly enough. But I know that most elementary curricula mention that somewhere along the way in with the whole Thanksgiving Puritan, Roger Williams, early America discussion, which isn't a very in-depth discussion in our schools. It's kind of a sort of a story we tell within a set frame without a lot of details. The details are the devil in that story, and without dragging out all the details, and I don't know all the dates and times, but very quickly there were a lot of conflicts over land squatting, land purchases, arguments about land purchases, cows and pigs tearing up native gardens, and complaints from colonials that native dogs were bothering them, which got back the Wampanoag and I think some of their friends petitioned the king in England successfully. The native people here were very sophisticated about negotiations and understood the system, petitioning the chiefs and councils, and had alliances and confederations themselves.
Yes.
So this was familiar territory, and they very quickly mastered English, which is something was for one way. not even Roger Williams, nobody, not even Eliot, could be really said to have mastered a native language. And they admitted their frustration at attempting to do so. But they're so radically different grammatically that English speakers have to be forgiven for finding it a barrier because of the gigantic differences in grammar. Perhaps a German or a speaker of Greek would be more successful because of the comparative nearness of grammar. We simply don't decline anything, and Algonquian and German Greek decline everything. But anyway, and our declension systems are very complicated. But nonetheless, they quickly mastered English, wrote a very sophisticated document, which in legal terms, and sent it off to the King's Court, which was approved by the King's Court, and the King put a moratorium on land deals with native people, which was unfortunately not respected. And what evolved right after that was wholesale land squatting, which led to King Philip's War. The war started over people squatting on land, people trying to take land back that was being taken from them, some dead cows, some fist fights, and a couple of shootings launched this war. And that's the way the tale gets told. But I think if we look at just one little window of fact, the tale changes quite tremendously and speaks to the real underlying truth of this whole conflict and the loss of human rights, which is that King Philip's War started just when the beaver trade collapsed in Massachusetts. And I've seen that in town documents, history documents in New York and in Western Massachusetts about the number of beaver pelts being sold out from major points of sale. And I'm more familiar with the Westchester tallies, but around 1620 they climbed from like 20,000 way up to 60, 70,000 a year. Huge numbers when you consider that's not just Westchester County, which wasn't a county yet, but probably includes all of Phillips Manor, which included other counties and probably had a reach out into the country some. But nonetheless, out of that area, they were sending that kind of number of pelts in a year, which by the time we reached 1650 and 1660 has fallen to 20,000, then to 7,000, then to, it's falling arithmetically by halves from one year to the next, and then there's no further records. At the time that the trade collapses in southern New York, Kieft's War and the major Dutch wars of genocide against the Mohican peoples and the southern Munsee peoples of that area are launched. And just at the time, so Holyoke's son, Holyoke William was or Pynchon rather, William Pynchon was a pelt trader. His son was a land speculator.
Where does the Holyoke name come in?
Eliza Holyoke was the wealthy Englishman back in England for whom Pynchon swindled land, to put it quite frankly. And Pynchon was his guy on the ground without the money. But yeah. And so no beavers left to trade, so John Pynchon turned to land speculation. Just before the onset of King Philip's War. It's very clear to me that the launch for wholesale genocide was motivated by a desire for land and resources. They wanted the forests, they wanted the land for agriculture, and they wanted the minerals. And the first thing that happened after, the people of Western Massachusetts were sent into diaspora, and this, deep Holocaust occurred where excess of 80 or 90% of us were killed off through massacres, germ warfare, and starvation, intentional, so where they burned our crops and left us to starve all winter. The next thing that happened was the deforestation of Western Massachusetts. People moved in, settling, and that drove an industry that helped make, Massachusetts and Connecticut wealthy. We have our colonial American cabinetry, which is priceless stuff up there with Chippendale, and deserves to be. But it needs to be understood that the South is not the only part of the nation that's guilty of getting rich on the backs of slavery or inhuman behavior. The Northeast also got rich on the backs of the back of genocide and land grab. And they got those forests for free by taking out the people who lived there. What happened next was that people moved in, and they began, the first phase of genocide is to kill the people and send them running. As we see,
In the
sadly,
wars in Afghanistan and Iraq?
too much.
It's
too
like
much.
going
The
on.
Rohingya in Burma now, which is sad to see even a Buddhist nation engage in purging and genocide, and someone like Aung San Suu Kyi engaging in human rights violations is tragic, and speaks to a world that is deeply confused, to put it quite simply, and we need to find our direction again. But and it has occurred here. So that was the first layer. They killed as many as they could, and the rest were sent running. And my people, the Nashwe Nipmuc, that's why I'm Nashwe Nipmuc and Mohawk, we fled to Skagdikoke, and with the Abenaki of southern Madasikoki and the Piscataway and people like this, Piscataqua, and the Missisquoi, and we all ended up at the St. Francis Mission, not all of us, but many of us, which is called Odanak, the village, and at Skagdikoke, which is in the Hudson Valley. The Skagdikoke, in turn, were chased out of their land at the end of guns and smallpox-infected blankets, and ended up in a couple of places. And then my husband, in turn, he's Stockbridge, Mohican, and Mohawk, and has the same story to tell. They came from Natick to Stockbridge to Skagdikoke to Cato, New York, back to the Berkshires, and we ended up at Odanak, and then Rogers Raiders attacked Odanak, and that's glorified, but the few Raiders tell their story. The several hundred people at Odanak and all the Jesuit priests and monks there tell a different story, which was that they managed to kill a handful of old women and sick people who couldn't flee, but the Mohican scouts came to us the night before and told us that we were going to be attacked at
We have
dawn.
just a minute or two left.
Okay.
But no,
So
keep on going. You're doing fine.
We fled to what is now Akwesasne, which is the Mohawk. It was then Mohawk territory, and it's now the Mohawk Reservation, upstate New York. And that's why a whole lot of Algonquin people are also part Mohawk, because Mohawk took us in. Their former enemies and competitors, because that's the native thing. And we took refuge there. So that's that layer. And then began the second phase. So following genocide comes erasure, which is actually happening in Belarus and Lithuania right now, where they're destroying Jewish cemeteries and synagogues because there are unfortunately hardly any Jewish people there are left to defend that. And we're facing the same thing here in Western Massachusetts, where you no longer have a recognized body as an entity. We've been denied our identity. The different government bodies refuse to recognize us as a tribe or anything. And actually, all the regional tribes are going through this grinder at different levels. And what followed displacement and diaspora and colonization was a spate of renaming. Everything got renamed. And that's a part of epistemic genocide or erasure. Right now, you take away the people's names from the land, and that's the second stage. And then the third stage is actually happening right now, where you remove the physical remains of a legacy from the land.
This is great. Actually, it would be a great segue into talking in part about the name of Amherst. And we'll talk about that when we meet again.
Thank you.
And this will be a second look at Native Americans in Western Massachusetts.
Bye, Nicole.
Bye for now.